Hello, and welcome to Working with Arrays. In the Using the Arrays Data Structure to Track Student Grades video, we will look at how to use single-dimension arrays in Java programs. We will then look at multiple dimensional arrays. We will use student grades as context for our examples. Arrays are sequences of variables of the same data type. This can include integers, doubles, floats, Boolean, characters, short, long, or even classes. Arrays are objects, and their contents are referred to as elements, each at a specific index position. So to declare an array, we use the data type, the name, and then we have the open and closed brackets. You can see here I have two different methods of doing this. The difference is the brackets can be after the data type or after the array name. Once we declare an array, we have to instantiate it. And this is an example of how to do that. Here in this example, we're instantiating the class grades array of type int with length 4. We can also declare and instantiate an array in one step. Here we've combined the declaration and instantiation statements into a single one. And when we create arrays, if we do not add data immediately, default data will be populated in our array. And here you can see the data type and the value. For example, doubles and floats will have the default value of 0.0. Character will have null, and if it's Boolean, it'll be false. If we want to add initial values to our array, this is how we can do it. Here we have a class grades array, a single dimension of type int, and we're adding 4 integers. And those will be at index position 0, 1, 2, and 3. So this array has a length of 4. You see that we did not have to tell Java that it had an array size of 4 because we populated it with data. It already knew that. Let's see this in code. Here I have a single class, and we have on line 5, we're creating the array and we're populating it with 4 integers. This loop that's on lines 9 and 10 is a simple loop, prints all the array elements. You can see here it's very simple. It starts with I, which is an integer. Set it to 0. We go until I is less than the length of the class of grades. We increment it, and we simply output the index position of class grades, the value that's at the index position. I'll show you the results in just a moment. We'll go through the rest of this code first. Here's a loop where we can average the array elements. So we're going to average these 4 values. And because it's division, we're going to use a float instead of an integer, and we're going to calculate it in the sum right here. So we have a pretty standard for loop, and for each iteration, we're going to take the value that's at the index of I, and we're going to add it to tsum. And at the end, we're going to divide tsum by the length of the grades. So it will be the sum of these 4 numbers divided by the count of these 4 numbers, which is 4. And again, we'll see that here in a moment. Here is a method where we can find the minimum and maximum values in an array. We have 2 initial integer variables here, set them both at 0, and then 1 loop for each one. Here is a small loop looking at the minimum, and this second loop here is looking at the max. And we're simply comparing what's at index position 0 to, as we start, to the next iteration. And that will change whenever a minimum is found, and here we'll change it when it's max. So you can see it's pretty straightforward. And that's the end. So let's go ahead and I'm going to scroll back up. We'll execute this. I'm just going to right click and say run single. All right, so what happened here? So the first output we have is we'll output the 4 numbers. And we did that here. This was a quick loop to print all the elements. And we printed them all on individual lines. Our second output is from this code here where we calculated the average grade. And it resulted in this output. And then lastly, we had 2 methods that showed the minimum and the maximum. We did that with this code here. Okay, so single dimensional arrays, pretty straightforward. Let's now return to our presentation and look at multiple dimension arrays. Now consider this table that's on the screen. It has 5 columns and 5 rows. Each row represents a student. And to use an array for this table, we need to use a multi-dimensional array instead of a single-dimensional array. The difference for declaring a multi-dimensional array is that we just simply need more pairs of brackets. So the first one you see here with 2 sets of square brackets, that's a 2-dimensional array, and you can see an additional one for each additional dimension. We're going to focus on the 2-dimensional array. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, we're still talking about class grades, and this is how we're going to instantiate it, and we'll see that in code next. So I'm going to clear the output. I'm going to close the single class, and now we have this multiple class. I'm going to walk through this code. There's a bit much more of it, not really that much more complex. And then once we're all done, we'll look at the output. Okay, so here we're setting up and populating the 2D array. You can see that we have the data type, and then we have 2 square brackets. That means it's a 2-dimensional grade, and we're calling it class grades. And then we're putting in each row of information one after the other. So here we have 5 rows of information. And we know by looking at the presentation slide that the columns are student and then 4 different columns for grades. And here we just have some variables that we're going to use throughout the rest of the methods in script. So we'll just set those as you see there. Okay, so how do we print the 2-dimensional array? It's a bit similar, but because it's 2-dimensional, we need nested for loops. So first we're going to loop by row, and then we're going to process each column within that row. And then once we reach the end of that column, we'll go to the next row until we're done. You can see here there's a system out print statement. So we're going to print the row and the column. So we're going to print one row at a time, and then within each row, we're going to print each column. And you can see here we're setting up the header row so that our information makes sense. All right, I'll show you the output for that in just a minute. Here we're calculating an average for a specific student. We might have a search function that returns what that student ID is. Instead of doing that, we're just going to say a student is in row 2, which we know by looking at our table. And we're going to print just this kind of header information here. And then we're going to calculate the average. Now we don't need to have nested loops for statements as we did up here because we only care about one row. So we have a single for loop, and that is for the column. And we're just going to keep adding the grade to the column or to the temporary variable average. And then at the end, we'll print that and we'll divide it by the length minus 1 of class grades. Now here, we're calculating an average for a specific subject. So here, we're going to have a static column. Now we're going to loop through the rows. And we'll add the grades in that row, and then we'll average them just with simple division. Okay, and here we're going to calculate all student averages. Previously, we did just one student, but now we're going to do all students. And we need a 1-dimensional array of floats in order to keep track of these averages. So we're going to loop through each row, and then within each row, we're going to loop with each column. And you can see here a column I set to 1 instead of 0, because we know the first column has the student ID, and we don't want that added into the averages. And then we do a little bit of math to come up with our average, and then we put that average into the current cell of the t-average single-dimensional array. Okay, once we have all that, now we can reprint our table and include the student averages. So here's our new header line. I added a blank new line just for clarity in the beginning, and we added the average column header there. We're going to loop through the entire table again, the array of class grades, and we're also at the end of each iteration, we're going to print the average row. Okay, that's the end of this program. We'll scroll back up to the beginning, make the output window a bit larger, and now let's go ahead and run this class. So here you see the first thing that we did was we printed the table that's printing our 2D array. That worked well. Next thing we do, we calculate an average for a specific student. And that was student ID of 4003, so it's this student here. And the output for that is on this line of text right here. Next thing we did was we calculated an average for a specific subject. And we actually did this for math and science. We'll change that real quick. Which is column 1, students column 0, math is column 1. So we just loop through this, and our output was here. Average grade for math for all the students overall is 82.6. And the last thing we did was we calculated all of the students' averages using a second array, and then we printed a table with that column. And you see the new column here on the right, and it has the averages represented by floats.